CEO Richard sold the company for $50 million and never informed me. He said, "You're just an employee." But what he didn't know was that my contract contained an equity participation clause, and my 10-year tenure made me the owner of 8% of the company. When my attorney filed a $4 million compensation lawsuit, Richard's face went pale. My name is Michael Chen. I'm 41 years old, and I just discovered that the most devastating corporate betrayal in my 15-year career had actually triggered the most lucrative legal victory of my professional life. But what CEO Richard Thompson didn't understand was that dismissing your chief technology officer as just an employee during a $50 million acquisition wasn't just insulting, it was financially catastrophic when that employee had negotiated equity participation rights a decade earlier, standing in the law office 18 months after Richard had sold TechVision Solutions without informing me. Watching him write a $4.2 million check as part of our settlement agreement, I felt the deep satisfaction of contractual justice triumphing over corporate arrogance. But according to Richard's version of our professional relationship, I had been a well-compensated technical employee with no ownership stake in the company's success. The company that had been sold and that I had inadvertently co-owned was TechVision Solutions, an enterprise software development firm that Richard and I had built from a 3-person startup into an 85-employee company generating $18 million in annual revenue. To understand how Richard had been able to convince himself that he could sell the company without considering my ownership rights, and how I had been able to leverage forgotten contractual language to claim millions in compensation, I need to explain the 10-year employment relationship that had created both his betrayal and my legal victory. Had joined TechVision Solutions in 2013 as the company's 3rd employee and first chief technology officer. Richard had founded the company 6 months earlier with venture capital funding and a vision to create enterprise project management software. "Michael, I need someone who can build the technical foundation for what this company is going to become," Richard had told me during my interview process. "This isn't just a job. It's an opportunity to be part of something that could change how businesses manage complex projects. What kind of growth are you projecting?" "Conservative estimates show we could be a $100 million company within 10 years. The enterprise software market is exploding, and we're positioned to capture significant market share." "That's ambitious. What would my role look like as the company scales?" "You'd be building and leading the entire technical organization. As CTO, you'd have equity participation in the company's success." Richard's mention of equity participation had been the foundation of everything that would happen over the following decade, but at the time, it had seemed like standard startup recruitment language, the employment contract I had negotiated before joining TechVision had been comprehensive and forward-looking. Working with an employment attorney, I had insisted on several provisions that were designed to protect my interests as the company grew. Given the early-stage nature of this company, I want contractual protection from my contributions to its success, I had told Richard during our negotiation process. "Absolutely. We want you to feel like a true partner in building this business. I'd like an equity participation clause that grants me ownership stake based on tenure and performance." "That makes sense. How would you structure something like that?" "After 5 years of employment, I'd receive 4% equity. After 10 years, that would increase to 8%. The equity would vest immediately upon any change of control or acquisition." Richard had agreed to the equity participation clause without extensive negotiation, probably because the company had no immediate acquisition prospects, and 8% of nothing was still nothing. "This seems fair," Richard had said. "If you're here for 10 years helping us build a successful company, you should share in that success." The contract language we had settled on had been specific and legally binding. Upon completion of 10 10 years of continuous employment, employees shall be granted equity participation equivalent to 8% of company valuation, with full vesting triggered by any change of control, acquisition, or sale of company assets. For the first 5 years, the equity clause had been largely theoretical. TechVision was growing steadily, but was still a small company focused on product development and customer acquisition rather than exit strategies. "We're building something sustainable," Richard had often said during all-hands meetings. "This isn't about quick exits or acquisition speculation. We're focused on long-term growth and market leadership." I had been completely aligned with Richard's long-term vision and had been dedicated to building the technical infrastructure that would support the company's growth objectives. By 2018, TechVision had achieved the growth milestones Richard had projected during my initial interview. We had 45 employees, were generating $8 million in annual revenue, and had established ourselves as a significant player in the enterprise project management software market. "Michael, your technical leadership has been crucial to our success," Richard had told me during my 5-year performance review. "The platform architecture you've built is the foundation of everything we've accomplished. Thank you. I'm excited about the next phase of growth. Speaking of which, your contract triggers the 4% equity participation at this milestone. We'll need to formalize that with our legal team." The equity formalization process had been straightforward, and I had officially become a 4% owner of TechVision Solutions, with the potential to reach 8% ownership after 10 years of employment. "It feels good to be an actual owner," I had told my wife after the equity documentation had been completed. "Now I'm not just building someone else's company." The second 5 years of my tenure had been marked by accelerated growth and increasing market recognition. By 2023, TechVision had grown to 85 employees and was generating $18 million in annual revenue. "We've exceeded every growth projection from our original business plan," Richard had said during our 10-year anniversary celebration. "Michael, your continued technical leadership has been invaluable." "Thank you, Richard. I'm proud of what we've built together." Together is right. "You've been a true partner in this company's success." Richard's acknowledgement of our partnership had seemed genuine, and I had assumed that our professional relationship was built on mutual respect and shared ownership of the company's achievements. However, what I hadn't realized was that Richard's perspective on our partnership had been changing as acquisition opportunities had begun to emerge, and that he had been reconsidering the equity participation agreements he had made a decade earlier. The first indication that Richard was thinking about exit strategies had come in early 2023, when he had begun having confidential meetings with investment bankers and acquisition consultants. "Are we exploring acquisition opportunities?" I had asked Richard after noticing several meetings with unfamiliar financial professionals. "Just preliminary conversations about market positioning and valuation," Richard had replied. "Nothing serious. Just understanding our options." Should I be involved in those discussions? As CTO and equity holder, I'd like to understand the strategic thinking. These are very early-stage conversations. If anything serious develops, you'll definitely be involved. Richard's assurance about my involvement had been misleading, as I would later discover that he had already been engaging in serious acquisition discussions, while keeping me completely uninformed. The acquisition process that would ultimately lead to our legal confrontation had begun in earnest in March 2023, when Richard had received a formal acquisition offer from DataCorp Industries, a Fortune 500 company looking to expand their enterprise software portfolio. DataCorp is interested in acquiring TechVision for $50 million, Richard had told me during what I thought was a routine strategic planning meeting. "That's a significant offer. What's the timeline for this process?" "They want to move quickly. Due diligence would begin immediately, with a targeted closing in 6 weeks." What does this mean for the technical team and our development roadmap? DataCorp is primarily interested in our customer base and revenue stream. They have their own technical team and wouldn't need most of our engineering staff. Richard's casual mention that DataCorp wouldn't need our technical team had been the first indication that he was viewing the acquisition as an opportunity to eliminate expenses rather than preserve the team that had built the company's success. What about my role in the combined organization? I had asked. DataCorp has their own CTO. Your role would likely be redundant after the transition. Richard, I have 8% equity in this company. My involvement in the acquisition isn't just about employment, it's about ownership. Let's focus on getting the deal done first. We can work out the details later. Richard's dismissive attitude toward my ownership stake had been concerning, but I had assumed that the details he mentioned would include proper recognition of my equity, participation rights. The due diligence process had proceeded rapidly, with DataCorp conducting comprehensive analysis of TechVision's financial performance, customer base, and technical assets. Throughout this process, Richard had kept me minimally informed and had discouraged my direct participation. I'll handle the acquisition discussions, Richard had told me when I'd asked about participating in technical due diligence sessions. You focus on keeping the development team productive during this transition period. I should be involved in discussions about technical integration and team structure. DataCorp has their own integration team. They prefer to work directly with the CEO during acquisition processes. Richard's explanation had seemed plausible, but I had begun to suspect that he was intentionally limiting my involvement to avoid discussions about equity, participation, and ownership rights. The acquisition closing had occurred in May 2023, with minimal advance notice and no involvement from me in the final negotiations or documentation review. The DataCorp acquisition is finalized, Richard had announced during an all-hands meeting. This is a great outcome for TechVision and provides excellent opportunities for our team within a larger organization. What's the financial structure of the deal? I had asked. DataCorp acquired TechVision for $50 million, which represents a significant return on our investors' capital and validates the success of our business model. Richard, we need to discuss my equity participation immediately. Michael, let's talk privately after the meeting. The private conversation that had followed the acquisition announcement had been the moment I realized that Richard had been planning to exclude me from the financial benefits of the sale that I was contractually entitled to receive. Richard, my contract clearly states that I have 8% equity participation that vests immediately upon acquisition. That represents $4 million from this sale. Michael, I think there may be some misunderstanding about your employment terms. There's no misunderstanding. We have a written contract that specifically addresses equity participation in acquisition scenarios. That contract was written 10 years ago when the company was completely different. The current ownership structure doesn't recognize those early agreements. The contract is still valid and legally binding. My equity participation wasn't contingent on future contract modifications. Michael, you've been well compensated as an employee. This acquisition is about rewarding the actual owners and investors who took financial risks to build this company. Richard's characterization of me as merely an employee rather than an equity holder had been both insulting and legally inaccurate, but it had revealed his strategy for avoiding the contractual obligations he had agreed to a decade earlier. Richard, I am an actual owner. I have 8% equity that was granted through a binding contract and properly documented with the company's legal team. I'm going to need to review that with our attorneys. In the meantime, DataCorp has indicated that your position will be eliminated as part of their integration process. Are you firing me? Your role is redundant in the combined organization. We'll provide a standard severance package. Richard's termination of my employment immediately after the acquisition had been the final confirmation that he was attempting to cheat me out of millions of dollars in equity compensation while eliminating any potential challenge to his actions. However, what Richard hadn't anticipated was that my decade-old employment contract was ironclad and that my equity participation rights were fully enforceable regardless of his personal opinions about company ownership. The legal action I had initiated immediately after my termination had been comprehensive and devastating to Richard's acquisition windfall. Working with employment attorney Patricia Martinez, who specialized in executive compensation and equity disputes, I had filed a breach of contract lawsuit demanding $4 million in equity compensation plus punitive damages. Your contract is unambiguous, Attorney Martinez had explained after reviewing my employment documentation. You have clear equity participation rights that vest immediately upon acquisition. Richard's attempt to ignore these contractual obligations constitutes serious breach of contract. What are our chances of success? Excellent. The contract language is specific. The equity grants were properly documented, and you fulfilled all performance requirements. Richard has no legal basis for denying your equity participation. What about his claim that my employment status makes me ineligible for ownership compensation? That's legally irrelevant. Equity participation rights are independent of employment status. Even if he terminates your employment, he can't void contractual equity commitments. The evidence Martinez had compiled included my original employment contract with the equity participation clause, documentation of the 4% equity grant I had received after 5 years, and company records showing that I had completed 10 years of employment before the acquisition. Richard will have a very difficult time explaining why he thinks he can ignore a legally binding contract, Martinez had continued. This case should settle quickly once he understands the strength of your legal position. The lawsuit I had filed had been a shock to Richard, who had apparently assumed that terminating my employment would eliminate any potential claims related to the acquisition. Michael is trying to extort money from a successful business transaction. Richard had told industry publications after news of the lawsuit had become public. He was an employee who was compensated fairly for his work. Mr. Thompson's characterization of the situation is factually incorrect. My attorney had responded in a public statement. Mr. Chen has clear contractual rights to equity participation that Mr. Thompson is attempting to violate. The discovery process had been particularly damaging to Richard's position, as it had revealed that he had been aware of my equity participation rights throughout the acquisition process and had deliberately concealed them from DataCorp. Richard knew about your equity stake and intentionally structured the acquisition to avoid recognizing your ownership rights. Martinez had told me after reviewing discovery documents. He was hoping to complete the sale and eliminate you before you could assert your contractual claims. Did DataCorp know about my equity participation? No. Richard represented to DataCorp that he was the sole owner of the equity being sold. He committed fraud against both you and the acquiring company. The revelation that Richard had misrepresented the ownership structure to DataCorp had created additional legal complications and had strengthened my position significantly. DataCorp is now questioning the entire acquisition because Richard misrepresented the ownership structure, Martinez had explained. They're demanding that Richard resolve your equity claims before they'll finalize the transaction. The settlement negotiations that had followed had been swift and decisive. Faced with potential fraud claims and the possibility that DataCorp might cancel the acquisition, Richard had agreed to pay my full equity compensation plus legal fees. Richard has agreed to pay $4.2 million to settle your equity participation claims, Martinez had informed him after final negotiations. This includes your $4 million equity compensation plus $200,000 in legal fees and costs. He's paying the full amount. Yes, he realized that fighting this case would be more expensive than settling, and that DataCorp might withdraw their acquisition offer if the legal disputes continued. The settlement payment had been made within 30 days, and I had received the full equity compensation that my contract had guaranteed, plus reimbursement for all legal expenses. Sometimes the best revenge is just enforcing the contracts that people think you've forgotten about. I had reflected while depositing Richard's settlement check, but the most satisfying aspect of the case hadn't been the financial compensation. It had been Richard's realization that his attempt to cheat me had ultimately cost him more money and created more problems than honoring our original agreement would have. If Richard had simply recognized my equity participation from the beginning, he would have paid $4 million and avoided all the legal complications, Attorney Martinez had observed. By trying to cheat you, he ended up paying $4.2 million plus. The risk of losing the entire DataCorp acquisition, the aftermath of our legal settlement, had been professionally interesting. DataCorp had completed the acquisition, but had negotiated a reduced purchase price due to the ownership complications Richard had created. Richard's misrepresentation of the ownership structure cost him approximately $3 million in reduced acquisition value. I had learned from industry sources. DataCorp adjusted their offer to account for the legal risks and ownership uncertainties. 6 months after receiving my settlement payment, I had used the $4.2 million to launch my own enterprise software company, building on the technical expertise and industry relationships I had developed during my decade at TechVision. It's ironic that Richard's attempt to steal my equity compensation provided me with the capital to become his direct competitor. I had told colleagues who had joined my new venture 2 years after our legal settlement, my new company was generating $5 million in annual revenue and had already secured several former TechVision clients who had been dissatisfied with DataCorp's post-acquisition service quality. The best outcome of a bad situation is using it as motivation to build something better, had become my perspective on the entire experience. The CEO, who had thought he could dismiss me as just an employee, had learned that contractual obligations don't disappear just because they're inconvenient for corporate acquisitions. Sometimes, the people who try to cheat you out of money, you're legally entitled to discover that the contracts they signed years earlier are more binding than they realized. And sometimes the most important protection against corporate betrayal is the foresight to negotiate strong contractual protections before you need them. Then the determination to enforce those protections when powerful people try to ignore them. Richard Thompson had built a successful company, but had ultimately learned that success doesn't give you the right to violate contracts with the people who helped you achieve it.